Hi, and welcome to our briefing, Powering Up, Improving Energy Grid Reliability and Resilience to Lower Energy Bills. I'm Dan Brissett. I'm the president of the Environmental Energy Study Institute. And we're coming to you today via the live cast only because of the lapse in appropriations. But this is a really important topic, so thank you for hanging in there with us and joining us online. Next slide, Troy. EESI was founded by a bipartisan group of members of Congress, and since 1984, we have worked to provide information about environmental, energy, and climate change topics to policymakers and the public. Next slide. We do our best to make sure that our resources are timely, relevant, accessible, and practical. We put a lot of thought into making sure our resources are always science-based and ready when congressional staff need the information, or better yet, before they know they need the information. The best way to keep up with our work is to subscribe to our biweekly newsletter, Climate Change Solutions. That way you can keep up with all of our briefing notices, our articles, our podcast episodes, everything like that. You are also welcome to follow us on social media at EESI Online, especially Blue Sky, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And that way you can make sure you never miss any of our briefings or other resources. Next slide. So briefings. We do a lot of briefings here at EESI. This is a snapshot of some of the ones that we've got coming up. On October 22nd, we will be looking at efforts to decarbonize the industrial sector. And then we will host the next of our rapid readouts lunchtime briefings on October 30th to take stock of federal disaster policy reform efforts and where things stand with FEMA. Then we will shift gears into our very intensive coverage of the international climate negotiations set to happen in Brazil in November. We will host 3 online-only briefings on successive days starting November 4th. One about the negotiations and possible outcomes, one about the global cooling pledge, and one about international trade. You'll not want to miss any of those briefings, which will help you answer your questions from your boss about what is happening at COP30, even without an official US presence. Once again, the best way to keep up with what we do is to subscribe to our biweekly newsletter, Climate Change Solutions, and everything, including this briefing, presentation materials, summary notes, everything we do is available always online at www.eesi.org. Next slide. We will come back to this slide at the end of the presentation. If you want to take our survey now, that's great. If you'd like to wait till the end of the briefing, we really appreciate the 2 minutes or so it would take you to tell us how we did today. We read every response to our survey, and we really appreciate all of the feedback and ideas and comments that you're able to offer. But like I said, we'll come back to that at the end of the briefing as well. We will take questions a little bit later in our program. We have 4 tremendous panelists coming up, and after our 4th panelist, we will be taking questions. There's a couple different ways you can ask us questions. One is to follow us on social media at EESI Online. We'll be doing real-time coverage of today's briefing on Blue Sky and our Instagram story. You could also send us a question to an email address, that's ASK, at eesi.org, and we'll do our best to incorporate your questions into the Q&A after the panel. So today, we're about to cover a topic that's huge and also a topic of huge importance: how we can improve the reliability and resilience of the energy grid while keeping costs low for households and small businesses and everyone in between. A few weeks ago, we hosted a briefing about artificial intelligence and data centers, and those are generating a lot of headlines right now about the stresses and strains being put on the US energy system. But there's more to the story, and our panelists will help us see the bigger picture. Of course, everything we do requires energy. The grid literally underpins modern life. But the ability of the grid to keep up with all the new demands we're putting on it is not guaranteed. Add to the equation climate impacts like extreme weather, and these challenges really start to hit home. Blackouts, unaffordable utility bills, and higher greenhouse gas emissions are just some of the consequences of suboptimal management of the energy grid. You're also in the right place if you want to learn about building new transmission lines, bringing online new power generation and energy storage capacity, and improving energy efficiency. And it would be pretty much impossible not to touch on the latest developments in permitting reform in the 119th Congress. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce the first of our 4 panelists today, and really looking forward to this slate of presentations. Paulina Jaramillo is Professor of Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. She's also the co-director of the Open Energy Outlook Initiative at Carnegie Mellon and a fellow of the CMU Scott Institute for Energy Innovation and Research. Paulina's past research focused on life cycle assessment of energy systems with an emphasis on climate change impacts and mitigation research. She's currently involved in multidisciplinary research projects to better understand the social, economic, and environmental implications of transitions in the U.S. energy system. Paulina's research and education efforts also include issues related to energy access and development in the Global South. Paulina, thank you very, very much for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to your presentation. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I'm a professor at Carnegie Mellon University in the Department of Engineering and Public Policy, which is a department within the College of Engineers. I'm an engineer by training, but we work at the intersection of technological systems and society and public policy. I also recently came back from spending a year in the House of Representatives as a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences. So I was there for a year working on in one of the personal offices. So this is also a welcome opportunity to go back after having been gone for 2 months. So next slide. I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of what we're dealing with and with the power system. So every power system has several components and at least 3. The components include the generation assets. Those are the power plants like coal and natural gas power plants, but also renewables like wind and solar. The transmission system, which is the large power lines that we often see when we're driving far distances, and demand points. So demand points are big industrial facilities, our houses, our buildings. Those are every power system has at least these 3 components. There's also a component that we have in the US, but it's not in every system necessarily, but the distribution system. Those are the lines that take the electricity from the transmission system to our houses. So they're electricity lines, they're power lines, they're just smaller than the transmission, large scale transmission system. Next slide. And so I would argue that the power system is a marvel of engineering, one of the largest and most complex engineering systems we have built. And it has historically had very specific characteristics that make the power system more complicated than other infrastructure systems, like, for example, water delivery. We have non-steady voltage, which is something I don't want to go into details, but there's fluctuations in the physical properties or the physical variables that drive the system. Our demand is changing constantly. It is very predictable at certain points, but not on an hourly or sub-hourly basis. We face physical limits like any other engineering system, like the capacity. And a single point of failure could lead to failure of the entire system. There's limited redundancy. Historically, a big challenge for the electricity system was our inability to store electricity. So in water systems, for example, not yet. No slide yet. Yeah. In water systems, for example, we can store water. In electricity systems, historical, we could not store electrons. That has been changing. And so that is relieving some of the challenges of having to instantaneously meet demand and supply of electricity. But that is still something we need to keep in mind, that we need to match supply and demand on an instantaneous basis. Now we go to the next. So historically, our electricity system was built around what we call vertically integrated utilities. And on the right, there's a brief description of this model of governance. Utilities were considered a natural monopoly, where a single utility controlled all of the assets of the system. They controlled generation, transmission, distribution, and the retail of electricity to the system. That's how we built the system, and that's how it operated for decades until about the early 90s or late 80s and 90s, where we moved to deregulating. And so that's the next slide. So in the 90s, we restructured the electricity system, and which led to the creation of markets. And so at that point, we moved from a natural monopoly to a model of competition. And there are different levels of competition, actually. The model, what we call here in this slide, model 3, it's wholesale competition, where you have generators or independent power producers, we call them, are competing to provide supply of electricity to what we call the load serving entities, or the utilities that we buy electricity from. So we no longer buy electricity from a utility that manages generation, transmission, and distribution. You and I buy electricity from what we call a load serving entity, and they buy electricity from a market where many independent power producers can sell electricity. They have to have, there's something called open access to transmission, so that everyone has the opportunity to access the transmission system. And there is operator of the system. Typically, they're called independent system operators or regional transmission organizations, who manage all of the transactions and coordinate the physical operations of the grid. In some states, we've moved beyond that, and we've moved to that wholesale market competition, but also retail competition. And so in many places, you only have one utility from which you can buy electricity from. That one utility buys from the market, but there is no competition for the clients. In some states, we also now have retail competition. And so I can choose who I buy my electricity from. They're still buying from the market, and it's a competitive market, and I have a choice of who I buy from. Next slide. So this restructuring of the electricity system led to what I think is a much more complex governance structure. This slide shows states that have gone through deregulation and which states are still deregulated. And so regulated states and you'll hear times like regulated and deregulated, or restructured or not structured. They're often synonym. But regulated states are basically states where you still have vertically integrated utilities, so that one utility controls generation, transmission, distribution, and retail within a service territory. In other states, we have, and so all of the little white reddish states are like that. They have vertically integrated utilities. And the blue states are states, and the yellow states are where there has been deregulation of both the electricity market or the natural gas market, or both. And so in these places, you have, in these states, blue and yellow and black, to a sense, the electricity markets or the gas markets are now through competitive systems. And so with this, we now have, with this very different heterogeneous form of governance for the electricity, we have some states where the public utility commissions are the ones that have the statutory power to regulate the electricity system. In some other states, like in the area where I live in Pennsylvania, it is a fully deregulated system where the PUC, the Public Utility Commission, only has jurisdiction over regulation of the load serving entities and the tariffs I pay for electricity, but nothing related to transmission and markets. FERC has jurisdiction over that, so the federal government. And so you have this very fragmented regulatory structure and governance structure. Next. And so we face also new challenges. Before, when we started building our electricity system, we controlled generation. We knew very well how generation plants operated, and we have a pretty good sense of what demand for electricity was going to be. We now have a massive demand growth as a result of AI, as well as growth because of electrification of end uses, and because of the need to decarbonize our electricity system. And I realize that decarbonization is not a policy priority right now, but it's still one of the things that we will face. And these other things, variable climate risk, aging infrastructure. Next. And here, I just want to highlight what we mean by these challenges. This is some work we did in my research group where we, in the blue line is how much demand for electricity might change by 2030 as a result of AI. And the bar plots show how much additional capacity we would need in different parts of the country. And this is in some scenarios in the East alone, that's a 60, we would need 60 gigawatts of additional electricity by 2030. Next. Which also means we need a lot of transmission. So the lines here, the green lines are the what our models suggest are transmission requirements. Next. And this is a decarbonization, just also to highlight that we will need a massive growth in capacity of generation for electricity. Next. And so this poses multiple barriers, and this, I'm almost done. The inconsistent regulatory structure makes it really hard to know who's responsible for planning the grid. We are dealing with cost allocations, and for other speakers will talk about these. It's very difficult to site infrastructure right now in the US. As an engineer, I argue that technological gaps are not the main barrier to the modernization of the grid. There's always room for innovation, but we have a lot of the technologies or most of the technologies that we need. And if you're interested, next slide, if you're interested in hearing more about what I have to say, here's my new Substack newsletter where I write weekly on some of these issues. Thank you, and I apologize for going a little over.
Oh, not necessary. I'm not sure the plug for another newsletter, though. I'm just teasing. Everyone can sign up for Paulina's newsletter after they sign up for Climate Change Solutions or confirm their subscription to Climate Change Solutions. But Paulina just presented some great slides. Just a reminder that all of the presentation materials from today are posted online, www.eesi.org. You want to go back and you want to revisit the slides, that's a great thing to do. We'll also have summary notes and an archive of the live cast as well. We'll also have questions. So if you were just listening to Paulina and you're about to listen to our next panelists and you've got questions, send us an email with those questions. The email address to use is ask, that's ASK, at eesi.org, or follow us on social media at EESI Online. Next up is Zach Zimmerman. Zach is the Research and Policy Manager for Grid Strategies, focused on the economic and regulatory analysis of power markets and transmission. His work includes writing reports and responding to government policy proposals for Grid Strategies clients, as well as facilitating the Advancing Modern Power Lines Coalition to support the deployment of high-performance conductors on the grid. He also supports the Working for Advanced Transmission Technologies, WATT, W-A-T-T, Coalition's policy and advocacy work. Zach previously worked as a legislative assistant for the Minnesota House Energy and Climate Committee. Zach, welcome to our briefing today. Over to you.
Thank you. And thanks for the introduction. As Daniel said, I am a research and policy manager at Grid Strategies. We are a transmission and bulk power markets regulatory and economic consulting firm. So we spend a lot of time on the reliability and economic benefits of the grid. So Paulina teed up a wonderful overview of the power systems, and I will dive a little bit more into kind of the benefits and barriers to that are facing transmission today, the transmission system today. So if you want to go to the next slide, please. So Paulina touched on this very briefly, and I just want to highlight that this is actually one of the really difficult things about the power system today. The electricity industry grew up as approximately 3,000 separate utilities that were focused on their own, small monopoly service territory. And so we haven't really gotten out of that framework today. This fragmented kind of utility and regulatory structure is not designed to plan, permit, or pay for large regional transmission lines that are more like interstate highway type projects. For this reason, transmission has always been very hard, and particularly like any linear infrastructure for that matter, because you must string together a lot of individual pieces of land, and each of those pieces of land to like put together a right of way is always important to someone. So putting together the work of large regional transmission plans is difficult work. If you go to the next slide, as Paulina mentioned, we moved kind of from this like vertically integrated system to more of a deregulated system. And as we did that, we also recognized the need for larger regional planning processes to kind of work at developing some of these bigger transmission lines. Unfortunately, we've had limited success with that so far. You can see on the map here that many regions are often not planning are not doing a great job of planning for regional transmission lines. So if you go to the next slide, the result of this has been that in recent years, we've built very little high capacity transmission across the country. Just this past year in 2024, we only built about 800 or almost 900 miles of high capacity transmission. This is down from an average a little over a decade ago of close to 1,800 miles per year of high capacity transmission. So while we're decreasing in the number of like big transmission lines that we're building, the amount of money that we're investing in the power system overall is rising. And this is gets to some of the barriers that are issues facing the grid that Paulina talked about. One of those is just that it's an aging system. Much of the big transmission lines were built in the 1950s and 1960s and are reaching the end of their natural life, and so are needing to be replaced. So we're kind of in this infrastructure renewal cycle, which requires replacing aging assets. And we need to be making sure that we're doing that in the most efficient way possible to keep the system affordable for consumers. If you go to the next slide. So why do we care about this, or like what are these benefits of transmission? So transmission provides both reliability and economic benefits to consumers. You can see on these slides here, the middle figure is congestion costs across the country. Congestion essentially represents restriction of lowest cost energy, making it to consumers. It means that there's constraints on the grid that prevent low cost energy from getting to consumers. Adding more transmission capacity allows those lowest costs and most reliable resources to flow to consumers. Last year, congestion costs were around 12 billion for the nation. And so adding transmission helps to reduce those costs. And then in the top right, you can see a figure showing load during extreme weather events. So the other thing that transmission does is it allows regions to access diverse supplies of generation, but also to make use of differences in uses of electricity or demand for electricity. So because we have a large country geographically and time zones and other things that shift when people use electricity, if you have transmission lines that span those regions, you're actually able to make use of spare generations in neighboring regions. This allows for like a lower overall investment or like in power generation overall and sharing of cooling of power, which is useful in particular during extreme weather events, which often are very localized and may stress local parts of the grid, but your neighbors may have spare capacity that they can provide you. So both transmission provides both reliability and those economic benefits. If you go to the next slide, we've also done a lot of research into the real like tangible impacts that this has for consumers. If you're able to plan transmission well and kind of optimize the build out of transmission alongside generation, it's shown to save consumers money on their like electric bills. So one of the reasons for this is simply economies of scale. As you go up in the voltage of transmission lines or increase the capacity of the lines, you actually provide significant savings in power delivery to consumers. And so this, we've done analysis that shows that expanding transmission could save US households somewhere between like $6 and $10 billion per year just by more efficiently accessing electricity, lowest cost electricity, I should say. Yeah, okay, we can go to the next slide. So I touched on this at the beginning, but at Grid Strategies, we often talk about the 3 Ps of transmission. So that's planning for transmission, paying for transmission, and permitting transmission. So these next few slides will just kind of cover those 3 barriers. So on the first one, I showed that map at the beginning, kind of showing how regional planning processes across the country may not be meeting sort of the best practices that we know are out there. Often transmission planning is too near term, does not account for all the drivers of transmission, such as load growth or new additions of generation that Paulina talked about, or even extreme weather. Many of these planning processes also don't consider all of the benefits of transmission that can be provided to consumers. So while some of those planning shortfalls do exist, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, recently issued Order 1920, which is it's called the Transmission Planning Cost Allocation Rule, and it's aimed at these regional planning organizations and attempting to get them to adopt some of these best practices. So at a high level, it essentially requires planners to look out 20 years to consider, the best available public information around load growth or generation forecasts. And then it requires them to consider different scenarios of the future that kind of like bookend what might be possible. Once plans are developed based on those future scenarios, it then requires that those planners also look at the benefits of those plans, and those benefits are reliability and economic only. So it's looking at how do these transmission plans improve reliability for consumers and also save consumers money. The one area where we're still we're lacking, I would say, in the planning department is in interregional transmission. We have very limited interregional transmission planning right now. And so there is work to be done in improving like communication and planning between regions. So we can get into that maybe more in the Q&A portion. If you go to the next slide. The other thing I wanted to briefly touch on is paying for transmission. So there is this issue where really kind of across the country, we need to work on a standardized definition of transmission benefits so that we can make sure people are paying for the proper amounts of different transmission lines. Right now, we don't have that exists. There's been several proposals in Congress to kind of work on standardizing those definitions. FERC also addressed this briefly, as I talked about in Order 1920. But there are also other ways beyond just like those planning tools to address paying for transmission. For example, there's the Transmission Facilitation Program, which tries to get at this chicken and egg problem that comes up with financing for transmission, where a transmission line is this huge infrastructure project. It takes many years to develop, and that like financial risk for that can be serious. And so the DOE actually has a program to invest in transmission lines and provide some of that upfront certainty to other investors or generation projects that may want to subscribe to the line in the future. And it just helps to ease that development process going forward. Next slide. Okay, I'll end here on permitting, and I know Kyle will dive into this a little bit more, but just wanted to touch on some of the barriers related to permitting. Right now, for the large interregional transmission projects, it often takes 15 years or more to develop these lines for many of the reasons that we've already talked about, and much of that is because of permitting. It is a very balkanized process between federal, state, and local permits. Sometimes even county by county permits are required for transmission lines. This is an incredibly time-consuming process that transmission developers have to undertake. And I believe the average time for a federal agency to complete NEPA environmental impact statements for transmission projects is around 4 years. And it usually can take even longer for large-scale projects. On top of that, once you complete the NEPA review, there are other project authorizations that have to be secured as well before you can even begin construction. And so those can even take sometimes several years longer. So it can be a rather significant undertaking. And again, there have been initiatives to try to address some of these things. and we can discuss this more in depth, maybe in Q&A. But one I just wanted to highlight is the CITEP program from DOE, and I apologize that I don't have the acronym ready off the top of my head, but the idea is that the Department of Energy would be the lead permitting agency for all major transmission lines that apply to the program, and the goal is to cut average permitting times in half for these large projects. So there's only a few projects that have applied so far, and so we haven't really necessarily seen the results of it yet, but did want to highlight that some of those initiatives are in place. Next slide. Right. I forgot that I added this here, but just wanted to also highlight, in my introduction, I talked about working on advanced transmission technologies, and I spent a lot of time laying out the benefits of these large-scale transmission lines. Just also wanted to say that there are some advanced transmission technologies, such as grid-enhancing technologies and high-performance conductors, that can add capacity to the grid in a much shorter time frame than some of the decades-long process. And so we want to make sure that we're considering those alongside some of these big lines, as they can be a helpful interim step. And with that, I will turn it back over to Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. That was a great presentation. We are, and yes, I bet we'll come back to some of those things in the Q&A for sure. Definitely lots of things to talk about. Our next panelist is Kyle Davis. Kyle is the Senior Director of Federal Affairs for the Clean Energy Buyers Association. In this role, Kyle provides strategic leadership focused primarily on clean energy procurement and advocates for legislative and regulatory policies that improve energy markets. He has more than 25 years of experience in the electricity industry. Before joining CEBA, Kyle was the head of federal policy and Eastern region, that's the USA and Canada, for Enel North America. He's also worked for Berkshire Hathaway Energy, and that's Berkshire's Western Utility Pacificorp and Berkshire's Midwestern Utility Mid-American Energy Company. Kyle, it's always great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us on our panel today.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and always appreciate an opportunity to come over and talk about electricity policy, especially with folks up on Capitol Hill and staffers who are just getting into this subject for the first time. So let's go ahead and advance the next slide. One thing I want to do is just kind of give you what I call our elevator pitch. Who is CEBA? You guys may or may not be aware of us. We're basically a business association that works with some of the world's largest energy buyers, as well as energy and service providers, to advance low-cost, reliable, carbon emissions-free global electricity systems. So our goal is to be a trusted advisor, providing objective, unbiased information and the preeminent voice on energy issues. I always like that elevator pitch, but let me just give you some brass tacks. So we're about 400 plus companies. On the corporate buyer of electricity side of the business, it's a lot of the names you guys have heard before. It's going to be the large big tech, AI data centers. On retail, it's going to be large retailers like Walmart and Target and 7-Eleven, those types of folks. On the manufacturing side, it could be everybody from semiconductors to automobile manufacturers. And from consumer products, it's going to be folks like Pepsi and Disney and those types of folks. The one common denominator amongst all these different buyers is they're really interested in having the opportunity to go out and accomplish electricity procurement that has three main attributes. First, reliability. That is number one for all these different operations. Two is a reasonable price for that electricity. And three, it's going to be innovation, and in our case, carbon emissions-free electricity. So most of these corporations have individual clean energy procurement goals. Some of them have decarbonization goals of their operations, but all of them have some form of clean electricity procurement goals that they're shooting for. Let's go ahead and advance the next slide. So one of the things that we try and do here at CEBA is we're educating stakeholders, not just our own members. I mean, our bread and butter is teaching corporations how to go and directly do electricity procurement in the electricity markets, some of which have lots of headcount and resources to be able to accomplish that. Others, it's just a single person. And so what we were created for, and what we've continued to do is just offer those basic education and training resources for the corporate community on how to become more directly engaged with the electricity markets. The other part is playing a little bit of defense. I would call it ensure clean energy access. Our goal is to try and make sure that there are policies out there, competitive policies that allow us as corporations to have the option to be able to choose a cleaner form of electricity to supply our businesses. And then lastly, if we can look at opportunities to expand markets, we look at that as a form of competition. Competition is great for putting downward pressure on electricity prices. So we're always looking at different policy barriers that we might be able to work on to streamline things, to be able to achieve, again, those three goals that all of our members share, which is grid reliability, reasonable price, and then last but not least, innovation or carbon emissions free resources. And so part of what I'm going to be talking about today is sort of our thinking around permitting reform, which everybody seems to be talking about these days, and how we organize our thoughts on that subject. So with that, why don't we go ahead and advance to the next slide. So when it comes to permitting reform, what I really wanted to just touch on is how we think it's organized, or how the conversations are going, not just on Capitol Hill, because there's a lot of discussion around permitting reform at the state level as well. And this is typically how our membership has been engaging and how CEBA has been engaging as an organization. The first type of permitting reform that I would call infrastructure. What do I mean by that? Well, it's a type of permitting reform that isn't specific to a technology or a sector. It applies across the board to multiple industries and multiple sectors. So an example of infrastructure would be transmission, pipelines, roads, large public power projects, things of that nature. And so the conversation that we've seen that's really started the last Congress and has carried forward into this Congress are opportunities to improve the environmental review process through the application of new and interactive digital and AI and cloud-based technologies. So it's just simply updating the permitting approval process. There are some instances where, as a generator of power, you provide reports, for example, to a federal agency like the Department of Agriculture, and you're still submitting those reports in paper, hard copy paper via the mail. There is no opportunity to send it electronically or upload that data into a database. So there's just some basic care and feeding and updating the federal government's digital capacity and leveraging some of these new technologies to make the whole process a little bit faster and more efficient. Other topics, and these tend to be the more controversial ones, is to go back and look at some of our environmental laws that apply to all these infrastructure projects and see if there's an opportunity to revisit either the scope, how comprehensive the analysis has to be, or all the different activities that they touch, as well as some potential judicial reforms in order to be able to make the whole process of getting a permit much more quicker. So it's not meant to, inviolate the purpose of the environmental law. It's meant to try and improve the process and make it faster. And the reason I could give you is, it may, in the 1950s, it may have taken 2.5 years to build a bridge project. But right now, it's probably going to take you closer to 4.5 years just to get the paperwork and the permit approval process before you even break ground. So you've heard some folks talk about the fact that we've really forgotten how to build big projects in a fast way. And a lot of CEBA and CEBA's membership subscribe to that worldview, that there are opportunities to improve the permitting process. And then the last one I would consider is sort of a generic infrastructure. And this is something that Zach and Paulina touched on, is an opportunity to interconnect projects to the grid, or to interconnect big sources of electricity consumption, what we call load, to the grid in a much faster way. It used to be that if I had a power plant project, like a wind or solar project, that I wanted to interconnect to the grid, all the studies and all the system impact analysis that would need to be undertaken would take maybe a year or two. And that was especially the case with like traditional central station power plants. But that process in different parts of the country can be as long as 7 or 8 years now. So a lot of that is just because the different types of technologies, it's become easier to build and be able to make those requests. So instead of one single power plant, you might have an opportunity to have 10 different companies provide the equivalent power. There's just more volume on the system now. We need to find ways to kind of reform the interconnection queue process and make that faster. One that both Paulina and Zach really touched on, and it's something that we really look at as a potential no regret strategy if it's done well, and that's transmission related reform. And we kind of think of transmission as two different parallel paths that need to occur at the same time. Zach kind of touched it on the very tail end of his remarks, and that's the opportunity to deploy what are called the advanced transmission technologies. Some of those are software-based. What we call grid enhancing technologies tend to simply be software. Some of them are hardware, and that's like, advanced conductors. That's just basically updated wiring that gets stringed along those transmission towers that you see while driving across the country. A lot of those technologies have been deployed at scale in other parts of the world, but they really have not found a way to incentivize their adoption in the United States yet. We look at that as critically low-hanging fruit because not only can you take advantage of existing rights-of-way, meaning they're not going in and having to deal with community opposition because the transmission lines and the rights-of-way already exist. You're just simply replacing the wires, or you're adding equipment to those towers to optimize the system. And why is that important? Well, first, and especially in this environment where we're trying to win the AI race against China, it's a very, very fast way to increase transmission capacity on the existing grid, allowing you to then add more power plants more quickly without creating any congestion or system problems. And the type of time we're talking to be able to deploy those technologies is usually 1 to 3 years. That's how quickly you can do it. The other parallel path that we still think is critically important is new transmission. We still think you're going to need a new transmission, and what Paulina's chart showed at the beginning and some of what Zach touched on is this opportunity to have really long regional and interregional transmission lines so you can take advantage of the daily and diurnal and seasonal changes. The wind might be blowing in the east, but the sun might be blowing in the west, and the opportunity there is to be able to take advantage of those differences and share resources across the grid. So the challenge there in those brand new lines, ironically, when I worked for PacifiCorp back in the day, it was 2007. It's 17 years later, and one of the lines that I worked on still hasn't been fully permitted because it would traverse multiple states. That's how long it takes. So you can't choose one or the other. You kind of need to try and do both in parallel. Take advantage of the advanced transmission technologies for near-term wins and help deal with some of the problems that we see in the need for electricity now, and then plan for the future. The last bucket I have in here is what we call project siting. Those are individual bills that are introduced that look to tackle specific issues. I included wind and solar ceasefire. That's a conversation about trying to find ways to allow those technologies to continue to get permitted on a standard routine basis. There have been bills introduced that would make specific reforms benefiting geothermal, hydropower, advanced nuclear, things of that nature. So the good news is there's lots of conversations around these individual pieces. Certain of these ideas have already been captured in bills, and that's progress. Ultimately, though, they all need to be packaged together and make it across the finish line on a bipartisan basis. So we're hopeful that we'll have a continuous conversation through the remainder of this year. Maybe an opportunity, very small opportunity to maybe pass something before the end of the calendar year, but more likely something that could be taken up early next year. And just flagging that CEBA has signed on to a couple of joint letters trying to encourage Congress and this administration to move forward on some type of permanent reform. So if we can get to the next slide, I'm just going to wrap, and then I'd look forward to your questions. On this next slide, all I want to do is just give you some QR codes. If you want to be able to keep track of what it is that CEBA is doing on this particular issue, we tend to post our endorsements for individual bills, our blogs on certain topics. And then with that, if you could advance one more slide, I want to just say thank you again, Dan, for the opportunity. I could nerd out on this for hours, but I only have 10 minutes. Look forward to folks' questions.
Thanks, Kyle. See, if you'd stayed at PacifiCorp, that would have been done by now. That's the reason it's gotten hung up. It's because they lost their key player. Thank you very much for your presentation. As a reminder, and this includes the QR codes, of course, Kyle's presentation materials are available online at www.eesi.org. That goes for all of our panelists and materials as well. We've covered a lot of ground. We're bringing up lots of big topics. We still have, I think, like 45 minutes to nerd out. So if you have questions in our online audience, send us an email. The email address to use is ask, that's ask at eesi.org, or follow us on social media at EESI Online. That brings us to our fourth presenter of the day. Patrick Hennigan is Director of Federal Affairs at Pacific Gas and Electric Company. In this role, Patrick focuses on federal policy issues pertaining to clean energy, the environment, natural gas, and electrification. Patrick has worked at PG&E since 2013, and he's previously held roles in different parts of the company, including business finance, customer energy solutions, energy policy and procurement, and legislative policy. Patrick, thank you very much for joining us today. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Dan and the team at EESI. Really happy to be able to participate today and share some of the things that PG&E is doing on grid modernization. So first, a little bit about who PG&E is, if you don't mind going to the next slide. So we're one of the largest combined natural gas and electric utilities in the country. This slide is mostly focused on our electric business, given the topic of grid modernization today. So we have a huge service area, 70,000 square miles. We go all the way up nearly to the Oregon border on the north, in the south, just north of Santa Barbara, from the ocean on the Pacific coast to the Sierra Nevada mountain range on the east, and serve a lot of the Central Valley, huge agricultural area in California as well. 16 million people are served by PG&E. That's 1 in 20 Americans, which is kind of a wild stat. About 6 million electric customers. And then on the second row, we have some stats related to our electric business. So 757 substations, over 100,000 circuit miles of distribution lines, and over 18,000 circuit miles of transmission lines. So a pretty big service area. So some themes that I'm going to hit on today while discussing what we're doing on grid modernization. So transitioning to a cleaner energy system, a huge focus on customer affordability, and then also talking a lot about what we're doing to mitigate wildfire risk, which unfortunately has been all too common in our service area in the recent past. So we've done a lot to mitigate that. So next slide, please. So that'd be helpful just to show a little bit about California's electricity generation mix. So this is looking at 2024. So renewables made up nearly 60%, with natural gas coming at 35%, and then nuclear. So PG&E owns and operates the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant on the Central Coast. So we're making, I think, some good progress towards meeting the state of California's goal to have a net zero economy by the year 2045. PG&E is supportive of that goal, and we also have our own goal to reach net zero by 2040. So a lot of what we're doing is with the energy transition in mind. So can you go to the next slide, please? So I think it's helpful to look at, we saw the overall, annual share. So this graph here is looking at the supply trend on the CAISO independent system operator, the wholesale market, on a day in August, a couple months ago in the summer. So you can see that the green line sticks out, right? That's renewables, which is mostly solar. So it's, as the sun comes up and is shining throughout the day, we have a lot of solar energy, zero marginal cost electricity on the wholesale market. And then as it starts to set, then we need to rely on other sources to meet demand. And this is where we're seeing a lot of our peak is sort of the evening hours. And so we've continued to rely on natural gas power plants to meet a lot of that demand. They're very quick ramping and really fill that niche nicely. But we're also seeing a lot of energy storage come on to help meet this. And so some folks might have seen the infamous duck curve showing this issue, right, of a really steep ramp. So this is kind of another way of looking at it with the supply up top. But really, we're working to figure out, we have all this zero marginal cost electricity from solar during the middle of the day. The key is to store it and save it and then use it when we need it. And so we're really leaning into energy storage as a key means to help make that happen. So if we can go to the next slide. So this is up top's a photo of the Moss Landing substation. So the largest lithium ion battery plant in the world is also at Moss Landing, third party owned, and then PG&E owns at an adjacent site at Moss Landing as well, a large storage system. And then I thought an interesting statistic captured on the California Energy Commission's website is just the increase that we've seen in less than 10 years from 2018 through the first quarter of 2025. Battery storage capacity in California increased from 500 megawatts to more than 15,700 megawatts. And then there's an additional 8,600 megawatts planned to come online by the end of 2027. So we're really seeing a ton of energy storage come on again to help shift some of that supply from when we have it during the middle of the day, and sometimes we have to export it for little or nothing or curtail that energy. So now we're able to store it, shift it, and use it when it's needed. And this was really evident in the change from 2020, where we had to have some rolling brownouts, blackouts when it was a really hot weather day. And then we had similar conditions in 2022. We had some storage help with that, some demand response. And then just last summer, very similar conditions on the grid, but we didn't come anywhere near the threat of rolling blackouts. And the CAISO independent system operator really singled out energy storage on the grid to help meet that. So we can go to the next slide. Also want to talk about a huge source of demand that we're seeing grow in California, and it can also help with this issue of balancing supply. So we're seeing a ton of electric vehicle adoption in our service area. So we have just over 740,000 EVs in operation in our area. That's 1 out of 8 of all the electric vehicles in the US. We're expecting to get over 800,000 by the end of the year. And so as a utility, we're really excited about EVs potential to help use energy at different times of the day, and even put energy back on to the grid when needed, or help with resiliency efforts. So we can go to the next slide. It talks about that a little bit more. So I think PG&E is really at the cutting edge on a lot of what we're doing with what's referred to as vehicle grid integration, or VGI. And the way we define VGI is altering the time, charge level, location at which grid connected EVs charge or discharge. So we've been doing a lot of what we've called V1G, unidirectional charging. So this is trying to get folks with EVs to charge when it's best for the grid, right? So they're not adding to the system peak, which can just add to cost for all customers. But it's really quite simple for EVs to charge most of the time, to charge at times that won't exacerbate grid issues. And rates, how much we charge at different times of the day can really help incent that behavior. Same thing with managed charging. It's just a little bit next step of determining when you want your vehicle to charge, or even if it gets a signal from the grid, or that it would pause charging or lower the level of charging at that time, but then still give the driver the charge that they're seeking, say the next morning when they wake up and they need to drive to work. And then the next step is doing some bi-directional charging. So vehicle to grid, vehicle to home. This is more cutting edge. We're doing some pilot projects, looking at how can we take advantage of all of this capacity and energy in vehicle batteries to help with home resiliency if there's a power outage, to help keep your refrigerator running, or even putting power to the whole home as part of a demand response or virtual power plant program, or eventually back onto the grid to help with local grid constraints or otherwise just grid needs. So we're doing a lot of cool things on this front. I think that's really cutting edge, and it is proving out the value that EVs can have to the wider grid. If we can go to the next slide. So one issue that on the distribution side, especially, we've seen some large loads, and a lot of those have been electric vehicle charging stations that would create a large demand on part of our system. And ordinarily it would take, could take years to beef up the system to be able to provide the capacity that those customers would want. But we worked out a flexible service connection program, which has been really successful, where we can bring those customers online a lot quicker. But we say, hey, for 5% of the hours of the year, we can't meet your max demand. You'll essentially need to hold back right from that max demand. But the rest of the year, you can have that supply that you need, right? So that brings customers online quicker. These EV charging customers, other large load customers can come on quicker while they manage their demand, and we build out the grid or other infrastructure that they need. So this is really helpful for the customer. Obviously, they're happy. It's also helpful for us from an affordability standpoint. So bringing on load like this really just helps us to take better advantage of our assets. We have a lot of fixed costs that, especially recently, I'll get into a little bit later, that have gone up, and we've seen our rates unfortunately go increase at a pretty high clip, and being able to spread out the fixed cost for investments for wildfire mitigation, other things like that, over more kilowatt hours can help actually reduce rates in the longer run for all customers. So we're really happy to bring on this load to use our system more efficiently. If we can go to the next slide. So I made it quite a ways without talking about AI and data center load, but that was intentional because it seems like it's all we ever hear about. But we're also seeing a lot of this in our service area. We serve Silicon Valley, so there's already a decent amount of data centers in our area, and we're really excited about it, again, from that beneficial load growth perspective, and being able to use our system more efficiently. I think it's only about 45% of the time on average is our system, or we're only at about 45% utilization of our system on average most of the time. So most of the time we have a lot of capacity in our grid that we can be using, and again, to help spread a lot of the other fixed costs on the grid over more kilowatt hours, more throughput, that can actually reduce the per unit rate of per kilowatt hour cost. So it can really be beneficial to all of our customers. So we're expecting about 10 gigawatts of data center growth to come on over the next 5 years. And I think what we're seeing is estimating that with every gigawatt of data center growth under the right conditions, that can be a reduction of 1% to 2% for all customers' bills in terms of what they pay for kilowatt hour. So that's what we're excited about from a beneficial load growth for all customers. If we can go to the next slide. So I think Zach hit on this a little bit, and Kyle did too. So we're also looking to get more out of our existing system, and what we're doing on, how can we upgrade our transmission system without having to, build new lines, right? So we're doing things that can increase capacity on those lines, or decrease the equipment fatigue, dynamic line rating technologies, increasing the thermal rating of the lines, improving capacity, efficiency, et cetera. So we're doing a lot of work on all things like this, again, with customer affordability, and being able to serve these new load sources top of mind there. Next slide, I'll jump over to wildfires. If we can go to the next slide, thank you. So yeah, we've seen, unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of catastrophic wildfires. Our CEO has made the stand that we're all firmly behind, that catastrophic wildfires shall stop. And so we're taking tremendous efforts to make that a reality. So I think the map on the right just illustrates sort of the territory that we operate in. Is over 50% of it is deemed to be high wildfire risk area. So there's a lot of hills and mountains and canyons that our lines traverse to serve our customers across the service area. So we have a lot of a lot of work to do to mitigate risk that we're doing. And the next slide kind of goes into some of that. So what we're doing, I like this, kind of makes it look very simple, this graphic, but for, to reduce wildfire risk, we're increasing our situational awareness. So we've really invested a lot in advanced weather stations and high definition cameras. We're using artificial intelligence and machine learning to analyze all this data that we're getting all over our system. So we know, what the humidity level is, wind speeds, and any kind of conditions that could lead to increased wildfire risk. We're really trying to make sure we have eyes, so to speak, everywhere to to understand what's going on. Operational mitigations. We got dedicated safety teams out there working every day. We have something called enhanced power line safety settings, which when we turn these on, again, when the conditions are ripe for wildfire risk, low humidity, high wind, these they detect a fault. There are sensors on parts of our grid that if they detect a fault, they can turn off the power flow within tenths of a second. So essentially that really minimizes the reduce of sparks starting a fire below. Public safety power shutoffs are kind of a later last resort item that we do if parts of our system are in these areas where the risk is just too high. We will sectionalize and turn off parts of our grid for as short a period of time as possible to ensure that nothing comes in contact with our lines and could create a wildfire risk. And then lastly, resiliency work. We're doing a ton to just strengthen poles and power lines. We just hit a milestone of undergrounding our 1,000th mile of distribution lines within these high fire threat areas, which is, I think, the most of any utility in the country to really minimize risk. And then a ton of vegetation management, just like tree trimming, basically throughout our very massive service area is very time intensive and labor intensive. And these are all, as I was mentioning before, sort of fixed costs that are recovered through rates and all ratepayers. So if we can spread these amongst a wider customer base and more kilowatt hour throughput, that can help reduce the per unit costs for all of our customers. The next slide just goes into a little bit more detail on how we're reducing exposure to wildfire risk. So I think I hit on most of this, but it'll be in the slide deck that folks will have access to later, as I know I'm kind of pressing up on time. And I think the last slide I have was just something that I still think is pretty cool that we're really taking advantage of and using a lot more is just what we're doing in the air, and that's using uncrewed aircraft systems or drones and helicopters to basically more quickly, efficiently, more safely, right, go out and really get eyes on our system to understand our assets and where they might be at risk, and just basically get those learnings from what we need to do to improve our system or mitigate wildfire risk or otherwise. So I think we're doing a lot on the leading edge of this too, that I think is really helping us to get a better understanding of potential areas of risk and mitigate them. So I think that's all the slides I had. Thanks for your time today. I'm looking forward to any questions.
Thank you, Patrick. And thanks to all of our panelists for excellent presentations. Given us lots and lots and lots to think about. This is, like I said at the beginning, this is a huge topic. I'd like to start the Q&A by kind of maybe cutting to the chase a little bit. So between the four of you, you just presented a ton of information. This is a huge, complicated problem. It's a physics problem. It's a financial problem. It's a time problem. It's lots of different dimensions of these challenges. And the solutions are available to us there's a lot of them, but they're not necessarily going to be easy to implement. So what does this mean for Congress? What should Congress be doing about this? Where should they be thinking about intervening? What is their specific role? What could their specific role be when it comes to modernizing the grid, ensuring that the energy grid is sort of where we need it to be to meet kind of the demands, the impacts on it, but also the demands of the 21st century. Paulina, maybe we could start with you and then hear from Zach and Kyle and Patrick. But what should Congress do about any of this? Or what could Congress do anything about this?
Okay, I have two pieces to answer, like a two-piece answer for that. So there's what they can do in the short to medium term, and I think the clear thing is we have an aging infrastructure. It is expensive to upgrade and deal with the needs of the grid. So there's obviously like a funding, right, need that Congress can do appropriations to fund some of these grid modernization efforts. And I don't think it's just funding the deployment of technologies. I also think it is funding the states, for example, to modernize their planning processes. Like I noted earlier, in some states, long-term planning is really the statutory power to deal with long-term planning is at the state level, but the states need support in modernizing what those planning processes could look like, given the different constraints that we face compared to when the grid started. And so it is, I think there is funding and resource allocation, both in building and the technology deployment, but also in the frameworks around planning for the grid. For transmission, FERC does have jurisdiction, and Order 1920 tries to get some of these, and some of the permitting reform bills that have been discussed include requirements for cost allocation and integrated interregional transmission planning. I think those are things that are very important and that are still a gap in the laws to support that. The second part of my question is that longer term, I think there's a bigger political project that needs to be considered to modernize the governance structure of the electricity grid. This fragmented, when we build a grid and basically you had many different grids to serve a smallish service area territory, then it made sense that like the state had jurisdiction over that. But we now have an integrated grid that connects very far distant power plants from one state to another state. And this idea that like the electrons do not respect state borders, but our governance still thinks states or smaller entities have control over how to plan the grid. And that is just not an efficient way of regulating and planning for the grid. But that is a much bigger political project that is, and it will definitely not happen in any, like right now or in the very near future. But I think if we talk about modernizing the grid, it isn't just modernizing the physical infrastructure, but also modernizing the governance structure of it.
So easy.
And I think that's
an easy solution.
Easy, yeah.
Yeah.
Easy.
Zach, I'll turn to you next, and then we'll hear from Kyle and Patrick. But like, how do you see Congress's specific role in addressing these challenges?
Yeah, thank you. Paulina took some portions of what I would say. I agree with what she said around funding. Transmission, I'll speak to specifically the grid and transmission because that's what I work on and know best. But they're large infrastructure projects. They're have significant price tags and take a long time to build. There are numerous existing programs which Congress could provide additional funding support for that could be very effective in helping to support these projects. And so I think that maybe also speaks to this broader, I think Congress can work to ensure that or like prioritize that some of its existing laws and programs that are established are followed or pursued. And then the other thing that I would say is that we've talked about some of the different gaps, both like regulatory, but also, planning wise in terms of like interregional planning. And also there are different, and funding, which I just talked about. So I think Congress has and can focus on filling some of those gaps and creating like more regulatory certainty for transmission projects. So some of that comes from some of the permitting reform proposals that have been out there. Adding interregional planning and ways to pay for transmission also provides certainty for these projects. So I think Congress there's a lot they can do to kind of fill in some additional regulatory certainty. And I think along those lines too, not having the kind of pendulum swing every 4 years, but really building kind of like long-term support for projects. As Kyle said, he worked on a project that's taken 17 years. That's several administrations. That's even a lot of different Congresses as well. And so sustained support is needed for these projects.
But through it all, Kyle was the constant. Kyle, same question to you. I'll pose the same question to you.
Yeah, well, let me pick up a word that Zach mentioned. I think it's a really important one, and that's prioritization. When we talk about this issue, and again, I'm repeating a little bit, we talk about it in terms of the policy solutions need to ensure reliability. That's job number one. In this low growth environment, put downward pressure on electricity prices, and then support innovation and carbon emissions free resources, ideally from our perspective. But the first two are ones that I think everybody can collectively agree upon. And I think going back to the point I was making earlier, where Congress could really be of value is saying, yes, we need to do infrastructure permitting reform because we need to get faster in how we build big infrastructure projects. And we need to provide those developers an answer on whether their project's going to move forward or not. And so that's probably going to require some judicial reform. But even if I could wave a magic wand and Congress solves all those issues tomorrow, we're talking about projects that likely aren't going to be energized and construction completed for until the 2030s. It's not to say that we're not going to need those. Like I mentioned earlier, you have to do these things in parallel. So I think you absolutely need to pursue the infrastructure reforms and some of the transmission reforms that will support new transmission. But I think today, given what we're seeing around the conversation on rising electricity prices and the disproportionate impact that's having on all customer types, we really need to be prioritizing the solutions, the low-hanging fruit that can address reliability, but put that downward pressure on electricity prices. And I know I'm kind of beating a drum here, but I think Congress could encourage FERC to jumpstart a conversation on how do we accelerate the deployment of those advanced transmission technologies? How do we deploy more grid enhancing technologies, reconductoring of existing transmission lines, getting FERC to finish their dynamic line mating rulemaking that has been underway for many years now. I think trying to really prioritize those solutions that address reliability, that's a given, but are possible tools of the toolkit to put immediate pressure on a downward pressure on electricity prices, that would be awesome. And then to continue the work, again, parallel paths, continue to work to enact overall reform that would allow us to build these large infrastructure projects more quickly and to give those project developers some certainty when it comes to some of the necessary judicial reforms.
Thanks. And Patrick, I'm interested in what you have to say as well, but you're the only person on this panel today who's even remotely involved in delivering electricity to customers. So also, what about that part of this whole system, the kind of the role that PG&E fills? What do policymakers in Congress need to know so that they don't do the wrong thing or they don't waste time doing what Kyle just recommended not doing, which is misprioritizing some of these solutions?
Yeah, no, thanks. I think I agree with pretty much everything I heard my fellow panelists, say on improvements that can be made and that where Congress can play a role there. I think, I heard Paulina say helping fund deployment of technologies. I think that would be huge, right? To just help test out some of these new technologies and then we can, as the grid operator and owner, we can start deploying them, right? Once they've been proven, like I think we're already doing, but there's always new tech out there that can really help. I think, agree with the points on transmission, and obviously we're only within California, but as our grid is expanding and the market's expanding across the West, I think whatever we can do to make it easier to build new transmission lines to bring more energy into California is really going to be beneficial. So we're all in favor of that. I think one additional point, that I would make is just, I think a lot of times, so California has its own, California Environmental Quality Act. I believe that's I'm getting CEQA, the acronym, right? But it's and then the National Environmental Policy Act, right? So we have to do both a lot of times, right? And they're similar but different. So I think just for expediency's sake, it would be nice. I think if we could just do CEQA, if the requirements I think sometimes are more stringent than NEPA, but that could be something where maybe if a company are already doing environmental reviews that are more stringent than what the federal review is, then that the state review could take the place. So I think that would help maybe shave off some time and a lot of administrative process and burden that where we're still getting to the same end goal, I think, of making sure that it's not going to have a detrimental impact on the environment. So that's one area where maybe there could be some congressional help.
Dan, can I add just one more thing?
Of course.
So I just want to remind everyone that Zach and Kyle talk about transmission, but modernizing the grid is not just about transmission. We are dealing with an unprecedented growth in demand, and we are facing serious capacity shortfalls if we don't act. We cannot build power plants fast enough. And so it is a parallel. Obviously, if you can't connect the power plants, you have a problem, so you need the transmission, but we need power plants. And that the regulatory structure around building power plants is not through FERC, it's through states and other things. And grid modernization is also about our distribution systems. Our distribution systems are all and failing. And again, what can Congress do about our distribution systems? I'm not a political scientist or a lawyer, but I think at that point, it really is about providing resources. They don't have a way to regulate distribution systems. So again, and that is like a huge thousands of miles, millions of miles of distribution lines that are really old and at risk of failure. So while a lot of the discussion has been on transmission, and that is a fair discussion to have, we cannot forget about generation and distribution.
So I just want to jump in real quick on the generation issue. It's a good point, but I think in an environment of rising electricity costs, I want to piggyback on the point that was made about how we add generation to address 100 hours of peak energy demand per year, right? So what that means is for the rest of the year, we have lots of generation sitting around not operating at even close to full capacity. It's just not being utilized. And the Western United States is a great example of this, where you have, I think it's like 30 plus balancing authorities, each one of them developing their own little generation portfolio and transmission system to meet their daily load instead of sharing resources. So I think as part of this prioritization exercise, that's why I put transmission first ahead of generation capacity additions, because if you can identify the opportunities and plan your transmission build out smartly on a regional and interregional basis, you're going to get more sharing of those resources, and you're going to be able to maximize not just the benefits of the existing transmission grid, but the existing generation portfolio as well, so that you're not having to add as much new capacity, new generation capacity that you might otherwise have to. So that's one of the reasons why we put transmission up front first, as one of those things that once you do the investment, that and energy storage, it has all these wonderful spillover benefits. And the only other thing I would say to the audience, when you start looking at some of the charts that are floating around about electricity price increases, you're going to typically see California ranked #1. You're going to see Hawaii usually is #2, and Colorado is like #4 or #5. Those are driven by wildfire costs, not just recovery costs, but then the grid hardening that's required. It isn't necessarily about generation or the transmission and distribution system. And a lot of those wildfires were caused by aging infrastructure that ended up being a contributing factor in some circumstances to those wildfires. So it's a real conundrum, but that's where I think the prioritization of transmission first, and then those dual paths of how you try to invest in transmission capacity. And then I agree with everything that Paulina said. In order to meet that electricity load growth, especially during those 100 hours per year of peak, you need to have strategies, including new capacity additions, to make sure you're not going to have any blackouts.
Also, good chance to make a plug for energy efficiency. The more efficient our buildings are, the more efficient our electric vehicles are, but especially buildings. That is something that unfortunately has gotten some negative attention on Capitol Hill, and it's too bad because if our buildings were more efficient, if we could reliably ensure that, Patrick, I'm sure you have colleagues that factor in appliance and equipment standards, whether they're DOE promulgated or whether they're state standards, and building energy codes. California, obviously a huge leader there as well. That would also be really great. And to Paulina's point, something that's kind of available right now and available today that might buy us a little bit of, give us a little bit of runway or a little bit of leash while we're building all that new infrastructure. I want to ask this question that came in from our online audience because I think it's a really good one, and I'm also genuinely very curious about it. The question is, 2 years ago, the then director of FERC said something along the lines of there was 2,000 gigawatts of power projects in various stages of readiness for implementation and connection to the grid. The question is, where does that stand? Has that number gone up? Has that number gone down? What kind of progress have we had around getting those projects built? I know there's a ton more projects proposed that are ever get built, but you know, that's an enormous amount of backlog. Any sense on the panel about where that backlog is? Not specific projects necessarily, but any comments on the panel about what the magnitude of that backlog is now and sort of what's happened in the last couple of years with some of that backlog?
I can jump in and get us started. That's what is called the interconnection queue, and is basically where you bring a generating project forward, and typically it's a local utility that you have to work with who will do distribution system impact. You know, what is the potential impact of this, and if it requires any grid upgrades, then those costs are usually borne by the project developer. I would say there's a couple factors to think about as far as what's changed over the last 2 years. One, FERC did enact a rulemaking order 2023 that would look to reform and make the interconnection queue process a bit more efficient. We haven't realized any benefits from that order yet because most of the regions are developing their compliance plans for order 2023. Some have moved forward with proposals. I won't get into the details of how some of the different regions are approaching those solutions, but we're waiting for that FERC interconnection queue reform to kind of make it through the system. The other one I would say too, is kind of thinking outside the box, is the tax reform that we just experienced through the reconciliation bill and the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And that is, there were a lot of wind and solar and energy storage projects that are in the queue competing for priority. Not all of those are going to get built, and there's going to have to be a reckoning by some of those project developers on whether they want to continue to have those projects sit in the queue or if they're going to drop out. Especially if these are projects that were more speculative, they were projects that were closer towards the end of this decade, and now they may or may not be eligible for tax incentives anymore. So they're going to have to go back and reprice those projects and make a decision on whether or not they want to maintain that queue spot. So those two things I think are going to be having an impact on the interconnection queues. We just haven't had enough time to realize the effect yet.
Zach and Patrick and Paulina, please feel free to chime in too.
I was going to jump in just to add, Kyle outlined an overview of the interconnection queue and where things stand very well. To his point, we are just at the beginning of really seeing what benefits could come from Order 2023. And so there is still this large backlog that exists, and there is a need to clear that because of the like acute large load growth that we're seeing from data centers and other manufacturing and sources of load growth. I also wanted to note that Order 2023, I think for a lot of people was a baby step in a lot of ways. It was a good step forward, necessary, and kind of address some of the like what I would say is lowest hanging fruit. There are still other steps I think that should be taken. There are some proposals in Congress that address some of those things, but there are still additional reforms I think that are needed to really streamline the interconnection process. And then I'll also add that one of the additional pieces, and it's got a lot of love today on the webinar, but advanced transmission technologies are a part of Order 2023 and are a way to bring additional capacity to the grid and allow resources to connect more quickly. So better adoption of those various technologies will also help with that backlog.
Thanks. And thanks for asking the question, person in our audience. That's a great one. We're getting close, unfortunately, to the top of the hour, which means our time together is coming to an end. But I'd like to ask one final question. And Zach, maybe we could start with you. And then hear from Kyle and Patrick and give Paulina the last word on our briefing today. And the question is, looking ahead, so a lot of the discussion today has been focused on challenges, but there are potentially solutions out there. So Zach, could you maybe identify an innovation? Maybe that's a technological innovation, maybe it's a regulatory innovation, maybe it's a financial innovation. But what's one innovation that you see on the horizon that makes you optimistic about our ability to meet these challenges with our energy grid?
Yeah, well, when I initially thought about this question, I was going to talk a little bit about advanced transmission technologies. We've covered that quite extensively. So I think maybe the one thing I'll say on that is I think, 5 years from now, the innovation I would love to see is that utilities have really adopted the suite of advanced transmission technologies kind of just into their toolbox. Like it's a part of their everyday planning processes. And really some of the more innovative technologies as well. There are some technologies that have been around for 50 years and have kind of been tried to rebrand as advanced transmission technologies, but there are some really innovative ones that I would like to see adopted or just a part of everyday processes. One other thing I'll note that I think I'd like to see more of a push towards as an innovation is the integration more closely of generation, interconnection, and transmission planning. That was the initial kind of goal for Order 2023 and Order 1920, but we have a complex regulatory system and they got separated into two separate rules. But I do think going forward in the long term, that is the most efficient and effective way for the grid, and honestly the most affordable way for consumers to have a grid that's planned in such a way where generation and transmission are optimized. So I don't think we should lose that even as we try to meet the growing need in the short term from load growth.
Kyle, innovation, something on the horizon that makes you optimistic about this whole business?
Well, I don't want to be redundant, so I'm going to try and think of something a little bit different, and that is simply the application of AI tools. I know the Federal Permitting Council has been looking at the idea of using AI simply to review a permit applicant's completeness. Right now, under most permitting regimes, you get, as the federal agency, several months to be able to review that permit because a human has to open it up and look at it and make sure it has all the required information that's needed in order to be able to move on to the next step. That might be something that isn't natural for an AI tool to be able to review a permit application for completeness, and where there might be some gaps, it can report that out. So there are the opportunities to automate. Similarly, on this interconnection queue that we talk about, right now you have to rely on human being engineers, no offense, Paulina, who have to take the time to look at distribution system impacts. What are the impacts of adding this generation capacity, or on the flip side, a new load to the system, and what are the steps that are needed to mitigate it? And it's one of those cascading things, because you can't look at a single project in isolation. You have to look at the cumulative effect of all the potential projects that might be added. There's an opportunity, and there's been some early work, great results by some of these companies that are looking to apply AI tools to help with that distribution system impact analyses that have shortened the review period from like a year or two down to months, and where there are incremental steps that used to take months down to days. Those are very early. A number of markets, our electricity markets, are looking and testing out some of these technologies, but that's a way of taking a new tool from outside the sector, bringing it in, and relying on it to really help you accelerate that permitting approval process.
And Patrick, same question to you. If you want to make it a national thing, if you want to make it a state thing, a California thing, something that on the horizon that you're optimistic about.
Yeah, I'll just kind of expand on what I was saying before. I'm really optimistic about, I think, virtual power plants and using more resources, right, that maybe the customers already have, or just using our assets, more efficiently. So I think I obviously touched on EVs, and they can be a big part of virtual power plants, but I neglected to mention that we have, I believe, over 900,000 rooftop solar customers within our service area and over 100,000 customers with battery energy storage. So there's a lot of capacity there that we're just starting to, I think, dig into a little bit. Some partnerships on virtual power plants for how can we tap into that customer side resource, when it's most needed, right? So we don't have to flip on a natural gas peaker plant or do something else that's maybe going to be more expensive. So I think with technology and AI, I think can help with this, right? Just so these systems can talk to each other and really take a lot of the sort of administrative work away from the consumer having to think about too much, right? Because nobody wants to think about adjusting your thermostat, or if it can all be sort of controlled on the back end, and you save some money on your electric bill, or you get a incentive payment, like all the better, while it can also reduce costs for the whole all ratepayers, all of our customers. So I think that's what continues to excite me, is just seeing the advancements in these technologies and how they can form a virtual power plant to help meet the wider system needs.
And Paulina, that means you get the last word on the panel today.
And so to not be super redundant, I'm going to be more geeky, very geeky here. Like planning, again, I'm really worried about planning. Like Zach said, planning transmission and generation together is like an important step. But modeling, to plan the system, we have to be better at modeling. And modeling these systems is really complex. These are very complicated systems. But what I'm optimistic about is that our computational power has increased so much that it makes it possible to do better modeling, not just by using AI models, but just because we have enough computation power to run the more physics-based models. I'm super excited about the idea of digital twins. And I think digital twins for power systems could be a really good innovation. I have futuristic visions of how that would look like. But if you have digital twins and fast computing, like maybe being able to really very quickly model what happens if this line fails or if we cannot connect these generation, so it could improve with the interconnection queue. So that's a very geeky, but that's also because I'm in academia and I'm always thinking about research. So
You're allowed to be a little geeky. That's fine. This is a briefing about grid stuff.
Everyone here is probably very geeky, just in different ways.
Yeah. The digital twin thing is really cool. It's very cool that you mentioned that, because I think we maybe need to do an article about what that is. I saw a presentation in April. I went to a thing at NC State, and they were talking about digital twins for like ocean modeling and like ocean health. And I thought it was the coolest. I mean, it was extremely well presented, but it was also just awesome, and such a great idea. So that's a great answer. Thank you very much for that. Unfortunately, that about does it. We are a little bit past 5 o'clock, so I'd like to start by thanking Paulina and Zach and Kyle and Patrick for joining us today. Sorry we had to be online only. It's always more fun sometimes to do these in person, but thank you for being great panelists and for helping our audience understand this huge issue, and giving a little bit of optimism about some of our ability to address some of these problems. So thank you for being great panelists. Thanks for your presentations. I'd also like to say thanks to my colleagues here at EESI who put the briefing together. I'd like to thank Dan O and Omri, Allison, Hannah, Anna, Nicole, and Laura, and Miguel for all of their hard work as we put the briefing together. We also have 2 awesome interns this semester, Haley and Olivia. So thank you very much as well. They're both sitting right out there watching this on their laptops. We also couldn't do this without Troy, who's in the background, our videographer. Thank you, Troy, for your help with as well. Troy, speaking of Troy, he just put the survey slide back up. Folks in our audience, you're invited to spend a couple minutes taking our survey. If you had any audio or visual issues, connection issues, live cast issues, if you have ideas for future topics, any suggestions, feedback, we read every response you submit, and we really appreciate your willingness to do that. Lastly, I'd like to plug some of our briefings coming up. I mentioned these at the outset, but they're really good ones. We will be on the Hill on October 22nd. Oh, thank you, Troy. October 22nd, that's our next big briefing on industrial decarbonization. Maybe that will be in person. Maybe that will be online only. Even if it is in person, though, just so you know, we live cast all of our briefings, even ones on the in the Capitol complex. So you can always, if you RSVP, you can always watch it later. That also makes sure you get the summary notes and things like that. But that's October 22nd. That's going to be a great one. You're not going to want to miss that. We will also be online for our rapid readout about the status of FEMA and disaster policy reform. That's October 30th. And we have 3 briefings, one on November 4th, November 5th, and November 6th, all around the kickoff of our intensive coverage of COP30, of the international climate negotiations that will be happening in Brazil. So sign up for everything. The best way to keep up with what we do at EESI is to subscribe to our biweekly newsletter, Climate Change Solutions. We'll go ahead and wrap it up there. Hope to see everybody, maybe in person, maybe online, on October 22nd. Thanks again to our great panelists, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your Thursday. Thank you.